Alright, so hello, I'm Diana Elizabeth Jackwitz. I'm a rising senior at Stanford Online High School. I'm 17 years old, and I'm here with Dr. James Doty, who's the clinical professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University. He's also a founder and director of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, and he's also an affiliate of Stanford Neuroscience Institute. There we go. So he's also an amazing author, and the author of the book which we're going to be talking about today, which is Into the Magic Shop, which is an incredible book that was so impactful on me and so meaningful for me that I felt inclined to interview this wonderful man. So I think today what I'm mainly going to be asking you about is the book, as well as your work with C-Care, and then also a little bit more about like your work as a physician, and then a little bit also about BTS,
that's strange.
Yeah, right. But who actually inspired me to read this book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that kind of is my first kind of question. So Into the Magic Shop is one of the most searched books right now in South Korea. It actually became the top researched book on Naver, which is like the main South Korean networking service. And that's basically after BTS released their album, which was inspired by the book. So how do you kind of feel about the international attention that it's gained thanks to BTS?
Well, you have to understand, before it was founded, if you will, by BTS, it was already in 33 languages.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes, so it's not so much that they found it, they made it more popular. And as you know, they're probably one of, if not the most popular K-pop groups, and have millions of followers. So with their using the book to create Magic Shop in their new album, that stimulated many of their followers in Korea, and that's suddenly it became, I think, one of the #1 bestsellers.
Yeah.
But it also actually pushed sales throughout the world, and it's resulted in, I already get a large number of emails that resulted in me getting a lot more, actually. And it was also sold quite a bit, was a bestseller in the United Arab Emirates as well.
Oh, wow.
And then in the next several months, it'll be coming out in mainland China, Vietnamese, Hindi, and so just mainland China and Hindi is 2 or 3 billion people.
Yeah.
And then it's coming out in Farsi, Georgian, and Mongolian.
Wow.
So it's
Yeah.
yeah.
So I feel like BTS has maybe definitely not founded it, because the book was definitely already very incredible, but they were kind of like a catalyst for millions of young people to read it. So how important is it to you that so many young people have found it through this group?
Well, I'm thankful that people have found it in general. To be honest with you, and you probably don't know this story, I had no desire necessarily to write a book. What happened was that I was actually at Desmond Tutu's 80th birthday party in Cape Town, which was a small gathering of people, and the birthday had 3 parts. One was a church service at St. George's Cathedral, and he's the emeritus pastor there. And actually, believe it or not, Bono was there, and both gave a talk and sang, which was quite amazing. And then the second day, there was a book launch party for a book that Tutu's daughter, who's also a Anglican priest, did with a journalist, which was more of a coffee table photograph book of his life. And then the third day was more of a traditional birthday party at a winery with a cake and everything. But on that second day, at the book launch party, there was about 200 people, and a fellow came up to me, a very tall, striking individual, he's about 6'7", and introduced himself. And like many of us who go to events, you meet people, but oftentimes you never see them again. And I thought that would be the case here, but about 2 months later, I ran into him, or I should say I saw him at one of my events where I was speaking. But he left before he and I could chat. It happened a second time. And then I actually hosted an event at my home for a friend of mine's book that was launching, and I did not make the guest list, but this individual showed up. And it turned out that he was a literary agent. And he said he'd been following my work for some time and had been very moved by my stories and thought my stories or my life would make a wonderful book, and would I consider it? And I had been asked previously, but I have so many other things to do.
I'm sure.
And the other thing he said to me that struck me, though, was he said, my father's my hero, and he's been ill, and I've shown him some of the videos with you talking. They're very moving for him, and I'd really like to do this book as a gift to my father. So he said, sure. And I didn't think about it. I didn't Google him. I didn't search him. I didn't even ask him any other questions. I said I would do it. And it turned out, actually, that he was Desmond Tutu's literary agent. And he had also worked with Richard Branson and others, and had done a number of New York Times bestsellers. And he and I became friends, and that's actually how the book happened.
Yeah, so incredible story. But I kind of want to touch a little bit more also on the international success, because you mentioned that it had been translated into over 30 languages. And kind of touching on the Dalai Lama, a lot of his teachings speak to how all human beings are the same. So do you kind of see that as ringing true with how your book has been received, that kind of everyone in all of these different languages can kind of relate to your message that is through the book?
Well, what I would say, it's not necessarily my message, it's a universal message, right? And this is why it does resonate. Everyone in their life goes through struggles. They have ups and downs. A lot of people, especially in the West, are self-questioning. They're very hard on themselves. They're not self-compassionate or kind, if you will. As much as it seems like most people in the world are doing okay, the fact of the matter is there's a large percentage of people who are suffering. They're suffering because of poverty. They're suffering because of prejudice. They're suffering because of drug and alcohol dependency issues in family members. They're suffering because of illness. And so the reality is everyone is suffering. And oftentimes people create a narrative that attributes their suffering to them having a problem, that they're responsible for their suffering, that it's their own fault. If they had done X, Y, or Z, they wouldn't be suffering. And the fact of the matter is that that's often not the case. And when you beat yourself up all the time, and you think you're not smart enough, you're not good enough, etc., what happens to many people is that they believe it. And they believe a narrative that they think is actually real in them, when in fact it's a false narrative. And when you believe something, true or not, the fact of the matter is, by definition, if you believe it, it becomes true. If you say you cannot do something, if you say you're not smart enough, that becomes a reality. So when you recognize that that is not you, that frankly you have limitless potential, and that it's okay to be nice to yourself, to accept love, to care, it starts changing how you see the world. It takes the world from being limited and dark to being unlimited and bright. And I think that that is something that's not unique to me, nor that message. It's fact, to be honest with you, there's no new insights necessarily in the book. What I have done is taken things that I've learned, which many people have learned, which have been written for millennia, and put them in the context of a story that people can relate to, and my own story. And I think I'm happy that that is appealing to people, and that it's resonated with people, because when you can identify with another human's experience, and you see that as you and see the possibilities of it, then you can change your own life. And I am fortunate that I have been able to do that with this book.
Yeah, and what you were talking about with limitless potential reminds me of Ruth's visualization, that that's what she went through with you, and how you your story about how you kind of changed your whole childhood and got into college and Tulane even when you never had imagined that you could, was really inspiring. So you also mentioned kind of about struggles and how people can relate to that. So I'm personally working on college applications. So a lot of young people are struggling with anxieties regarding like good SAT scores and how do I get into college and adulthood. And, you know, you've been through that yourself, obviously. So, you know, how do you kind of advise the youth in terms of like, even outside of the book and what you mentioned in the book, what would your advice be to young people?
Well, one of the hardest things to do is to separate out who you are and what you want from what your parents want.
Yeah.
And what they think is best for you.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's wonderful that those two things align, nothing can be worse than to have a horrible conflict between trying to respond to people who love you, but who want something you don't want. Mm-hmm. And that's hard. And there are people who are miserable trying to make other people happy. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to have a happy life until you can make yourself happy.
Yeah.
So I would say one of the hardest lessons is to understand what you really want and understand that when you are able to define that and you are able to follow that path, that's when you will find happiness. If you keep sacrificing your own desires, your own motivations for others, you will be constantly unhappy. Mm-hmm. And you will be, whether it's a relationship with your parents, mm-hmm. whether it's a relationship with a partner, mm-hmm. Until you can align who you are and what you want to your relationships, you're going to be constantly unhappy. So I would say that's a very important thing here in Silicon Valley, and we have an epidemic of children who are depressed, anxious, and some who've committed suicide, mm-hmm. and at a far higher rate than other areas. Mm-hmm. And this is in a place where we have great affluence. Mm-hmm. But the problem is parents are forcing their agendas down the throats of their children. Mm-hmm. And when a child intuits, and it doesn't have to be directly said, that their value to their parents mm-hmm. is as an object that has a grade point average,
yeah.
And they fail that, because not all of us are going to have 4.0s, and some of us, if not all of us, are going to have times when we have not lived up to our own desires. If you suddenly fail and you believe that you didn't get an A and your parents aren't going to love you, that's a horrible situation to be in. To believe that your whole value to your parents or to those around you is for your achievements. Mm-hmm. It's a horrible burden to bear. I had a young lady who was an intern of ours, and she was a straight A student at Stanford, class president, a degree in electrical engineering, had studied Oxford. Spent a year with me, or close to a year, and beautiful, and incredible, sweet personality. At Christmas, she went home and committed suicide. Mm-hmm. And the reality was her life was oriented towards what she wanted other people to see, mm-hmm. not who she was. Mm-hmm. And it was horribly sad. I mean, it was sad for her parents. It was sad for those who actually loved her and who would have loved her for who she truly is. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the problems, is that in modern society, we have a tendency to project to other people how we want people to see us, right? Mm-hmm. You know, I'm a neurosurgeon, I did this, I'm a professor, I accomplished this. And it doesn't talk, or people don't talk about the pain they're suffering, how they're hurting, mm-hmm. How they feel that they may not be appreciated, how they failed at something, because they're so concerned about being judged. Mm-hmm. To be an authentic human being, you have to be able to be with both parts of yourself. And those two parts are the part that's wonderful and great, and also what we call the shadow side, that part of you that isn't so great. it's still part of you. And as much as you push it away, as much as you deny it, as much as you wish it wasn't there, it is part of you. And when you're able to align those two, and to understand that even with the shadow side, even with your failings, even with every negative thing you can think about you, you deserve to be loved. And you're a good person ultimately. And you should be cared for, and you should accept love. And you should not be critical of yourself. It's when those two things align. You know, people ask me, geez, what's it like to be with the Dalai Lama or to be with one of these spiritual or religious leaders? And I say it's an incredible joy. And the reason it's an incredible joy is because in that situation, you don't need a projection of who you want him or her to think you are. They don't care.
Yeah.
Right? They unconditionally love and accept you without judgment. And if you can find people who care for you in that way, that's the greatest love you can have.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, you kind of speak to how we all deserve love and how we all deserve care. And so, you know, throughout the book, we see how there were instances in your life where you didn't see that for yourself. So how do you think your role that you've set out for yourself, like, has changed since your childhood or since you first met Ruth in the magic shop?
Well, you have to understand, when I met her, I was 12. And as a 12-year-old, you don't have any experience, and you're a child, and you have the fears and anxieties of a child. And in my particular situation, with poverty, with mental illness, with alcohol abuse, with difficult circumstance, that only compounds that. All of us are on a path to self-knowledge and to learn, and hopefully to self-actualization. None of us start out, at least there are very few who start out as saints or with all the wonderful insights that you get through life experience. But I and others, perhaps through my book, can gain insights and some awareness at a younger age and incorporate that into how we behave. You know, when you grow up with shame, when you grow up with fear and anxiety, it's like a monkey on your back. And it takes a while to understand what is necessary to let the monkey go. And sometimes it can be a short period of time, sometimes it can be a lifetime. You know, I was never mean or anything, but I was self-focused on my own interests. When I, if you will, lost the typical things that define success, and it took me back to a period of reflection, I realized success wasn't all of this stuff. At the end of the day, the most important things are living a life of meaning, being of service to others, of caring, and that's what gives you contentment, and that is what gives you true happiness. You know, we have happiness that can be defined by many people, and the term success used, and that's the acquiring of things. But that doesn't give long-term happiness, that gives transitory happiness. And this is why you see accomplished, wealthy people, they keep having to get bigger things, more expensive things. And there's something in Tibetan mythology called the hungry ghost. Right? It's this ghost that keeps stuffing itself with stuff, and its appetite is never satiated. Has a very thin throat and can only get so much in, and it's always empty. And when you try to find happiness through things, you're always going to be hungry. And the sad thing is, many of those people believe, because of what we see in society about what defines success, and many people look up to people like that as being quote-unquote successful. They keep trying to get more and more, so people will be envious. And frankly, those are the least type of people you want to be envious of, because they're doing nothing. The people you want to be envious of are the people like the Dalai Lama, like Amma, like Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, like Sadhguru, like a variety of these spiritual and religious beings, and an average person whose life is dedicated to caring for others. And this doesn't mean you have to live like a pauper. It just means that you have to be conscious that others are suffering, and that you have within your own abilities the capacity to alleviate that suffering.
Well, and then you have individuals like Kate Spade, who had appeared to have everything in the world. I mean, my sisters have almost all of her dishes and all of her purses, but at the end of the day, all of that, all those glitters are not gold.
Well, and I think there's another aspect, though, because depression it can be situational, and it can also be biochemical. And there's some people who may be surrounded by people who love them, and they themselves are out helping others and trying to be better people, yet the darkness is so heavy on them that they do not, even with everything and doing all the right stuff, it may still be too dark. So I think you have to be careful about that. I don't know her personal situation, certainly, but depression can be a very challenging thing, and you can have done all the right stuff, and bad things happen, and you just cannot overcome that.
For sure. So I want to take us kind of back to the issues that you were speaking about with children in today's society. So obviously you mentioned how when Ruth took you in, you were a child yourself, and yet over the period of many, many years, you were able to finally understand her magic. So how do you think her magic can be transmitted to the children of this generation, kind of even outside of the book?
Sure. Well, certainly I think the book is helping that, and I think that the truths that are inherent in the book through a variety of formats, not necessarily because of me, but because we know now through neuroscience and some of these practices how powerful they can be. I think that much of this is available. The unfortunate thing, though, is, in the United States as an example, we have a political situation that has resulted in a perception that the acquiring of things, of wealth, is important, that integrity, that honesty, that compassion, that empathy, that caring shows weakness. And no efforts are being made in our society at present, I don't believe, at least certainly not on a national level, or as a national narrative that says children should not be in poverty, that says children should be nurtured, that children should be with their parents, that there should be enough food to eat. We have a system that promotes the death penalty. We have a system that's resulted in the privatization of prisons, which then translates into a profit motivation. I mean, I saw the CEO of a publicly traded prison company who said he doesn't want to see drug laws changed because the prisons will empty and he won't make as much money. Now, how callous could that be? We are able, as a society, to spend $35,000 to $50,000 a year to incarcerate human beings, and I would submit to you that putting a human being, a being that is social, a being that we know requires interaction and community, in 23 hours a day of solitary confinement, that's cruel and inhumane. And to somehow believe that the practices that we have implemented in this country in terms of the prison system results in rehabilitation is ridiculous. And it's horrible. And so you also have a situation that has allowed for lobbyists to buy off politicians and result in ruining our environment by taking the environmental protections backwards decades. You've allowed a system which has taken the efforts of unions, which have allowed for fairness in the workplace to be taken away, so that corporate entities can take advantage of them. I mean, we have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour that a single person cannot even live on. And if it simply kept up with inflation, it would be about $22 an hour. And so when you have people who have been in a system, as an example, look at the other one. We allow for pharmaceutical companies to create the opioid crisis through lobbying. And who pays the bill? The taxpayer. You pay the taxpayer through crime, or the taxpayer pays as a result of crime, violence, destroyed families, incarceration, generations of children who grow up destroyed because of this in their families. And we as a society have created an environment, a national narrative that if you're poor, it's your own fault. This is a tragedy. What we should demand is an educational system where you can get college education for free. Because if you're rich, you get a college education for free, right? And we know that education is the key to change in your class, to success in life, to having a happy life. And this isn't to say that every person needs to go to college, but it says they should have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. You should have a situation where a family has enough money to live on, and that means a family has enough money to live on. Their rent can be paid. Their children can be fed. They can have clothing. You know, when you, and again, it's ridiculous. When you have a child who's worried about what's going to happen at home, whether they're going to be evicted, whether there's going to be enough food, all of these things cause your brain to not function as it should function. You have fear, you're anxious, you're scared. How can you possibly concentrate on schoolwork, right?
Yeah.
You're worried about just surviving.
Yeah.
This is an unfair system. And it's one that we should not allow, and it's one that we have to work together to change the narrative, to make America truly the beacon on the hill, not only for our own people, but for around the world, to say that we are the pinnacle of what is possible as a society. And that is a society that cares. And this BS about saying, well, you're talking about being a socialist, I don't care what terminology you use, I care about caring for other people. That's not socialism, that's humanism.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's funny that you mentioned that because, you know, I'm constantly thinking about, well, I want to apply to Stanford and I want to apply to Berkeley. And, you know, those are my main concerns. But it's like, it puts it into perspective that those are my worries, when some people, their worries are just simply like getting food and getting clean water. Like Flint, Michigan, they're not thinking about college, they're just thinking, can I get water today? So.
And also, I mean, you think half of the world's population live on less than $250 a day.
Yeah.
What obligation do we have for those people? And this is where, you know, this selfishness that is inherent, where you see, and we're talking about emptiness, where people have hundreds of billions of dollars, if not billions, and they don't get more generous, they get more selfish because they're so empty.
Yeah.
And they're not happy. And you have a culture of celebrity that celebrates someone who actually has accomplished nothing. And it's a sad, sad state of affairs. I don't know if I have a solution other than the fact that what I do know, whoever you are, each of us every day has the ability to make one person's life better.
For sure. So. Yeah. Well, that kind of leads me to my next question, because I was going to ask you about, you know, there's so much school violence, and children are just afraid to go into their high school for just fear of being shot or seeing their friends shot. There's also just rampant racism, gender inequality, xenophobia, and, you know, just the current state of what, you know, the the people in charge are spreading. So I wanted to ask you kind of, how can the message of your book, how can that be implemented into society today? Because it's very easy to look at society and feel a sense of, oh my God, it's gone. We can't get anything back anymore. So how do you think that the message that you are spreading in your book can be applied so that there is still hope, that we can kind of change the way the world is going?
Well, I think there is hope, and I think society could not function without the vast majority of people being good, period. So you have to understand that's the reality. The people who promote violence, who promote racism, who promote divisiveness, these are weak people who are insecure and scared themselves. Mm-hmm. And you have to understand that. And all of us would like to change the world. But sometimes our best accomplishment can be changing the environment around us. Mm-hmm. Because we know if you can be an example for others, if you can reach out and inspire others, mm-hmm. that can be a ripple that can get ever larger. Mm-hmm. You don't have to lead 1 million people, you just have to change one person's mm-hmm. mind. And the best way to do that is not by confrontation, it's not by anger, it's not by hurling insults, it's by listening, mm-hmm. being present, showing counterexamples, and showing love. Mm-hmm. Now, I won't say that'll work 100% of the time, but a lot of time it will. You know, I don't know if you know, there's a fellow by the name of Glenn Beck. Have you ever heard of him? So Glenn's a friend of mine, and now I won't take credit per se. Hopefully I contributed, but you know, Glenn was a very divisive individual. Mm-hmm. And even now I don't agree with a lot of what he says. But if you look at how he was 3 years ago, mm-hmm. whereas he was like a Sean Hannity on some level, everything was negative. And if you didn't agree with him, you were wrong. Mm-hmm. And now I have to say, I think he's much more thoughtful. Mm-hmm. And I spent a fair amount of time with him. I actually hosted him at Stanford. Oh, wow. I was on his TV show and his radio show. And in fact, he even wrote an endorsement for the book. So anything is possible. I think, though, you can't change things through violence. It's non-judgment, it's love, it's having an open heart, it's not being dismissive of people. Because people make decisions now, oftentimes emotionally, not based on rationality, and we know that. But you have to understand, what are the drivers of their emotions? Mm-hmm. You know, if you grew up in a place where you've been told a narrative that immigrants or blacks are the cause of your problem, mm-hmm. You can see how somebody could then be angry, right? If you feel that that's the reason you don't have a job, mm-hmm. you can be angry. And unfortunately, we have a very sophisticated media machine mm-hmm.
that spins these narratives that oftentimes takes people who are susceptible to those types of narratives and takes advantage of them for their own selfish reasons. Not because that's truth, but because it's a way to manipulate them for them to get more power. And that's what's really sad. You know, how is it even possible that you could somehow spin that you shouldn't get any welfare benefits, you shouldn't get unemployment benefits, you shouldn't get health care benefits, your children should not get an education, you should not feed poor children, when you're that group of people? I mean, how would you ever get to that conclusion that, oh, he has my best interests at heart? Except for the fact that it's spun as the reason you don't have those things isn't because I've taxed you and given tax breaks to corporations, or that I've taken away every benefit. It's because this other group of people, they've taken it from you. And if they didn't take it from you, everything would be just perfect. And unfortunately, many people are susceptible to that spin.
And especially when you put in the context of religion, it makes it even worse. Religion should never be involved in politics. Yet we have, as we look at how debased some of our politicians are, to be frank with you, some of our religious leaders are multiples of that. And it's a horrible thing to watch, how someone can go through a convoluted argument, as an example, about Christianity, to, on the one hand, look at one person, a person of color, a person of a different political party, and twist a narrative where their candidate, who may be a chronic philanderer, a business cheat, a cheat in general, a chronic liar, one of the most insensitive, non-compassionate human beings, and they somehow say that person's a messenger of God. And then you look at somebody, as an example, another politician who may be a person of color, who has had a marriage that has been untainted by any scandal over decades, who speaks eloquently, is well educated, and constantly talks about our interdependence, about how we should care for the other. And you spin those it's like you're in a parallel universe, right? And so you have to understand, though, how people are manipulated.
Yeah, for sure. So, kind of, with all that being said, I would like to kind of shift to talking a little bit about you as a doctor. So I want to be a physician myself, so I want to go into to being a general practitioner. So I kind of want to talk about how you speak about the hardships of being a doctor, from the first incident we see in the book with you saving the young boy, to kind of all of the other hardships that you go through. So what is your advice to people who want to become doctors, especially in terms of how do you get over the grief of when you do fail, when it doesn't work, or how do you kind of separate your emotional self from your doctor self?
Well, hopefully I don't. But what I would first say is understand what you really want, right? It gets back to the same issue. Many parents want their children to be doctors. But if you talk to the child, they don't want to be a doctor. It's just their parents want to tell their friends their child's a doctor. And so know what you want. Being a doctor doesn't mean you get paid a lot of money necessarily. You probably get paid a lot more than most people. I believe that being a doctor is still a profession. And what I mean by that is I'm not a healthcare provider, which translates into a limited obligation and we're all the same. I'm a professional, which means that my hours aren't 8 to 5. I have an obligation that goes beyond that. I have an obligation and a responsibility to care, right? And it's a privilege. This isn't a job. You are given the privilege of caring for another human being in the most critical, vulnerable part of their life, oftentimes. And so that's a heavy burden, and you have to take that seriously. And you also have to realize that you're not always going to win. Not everyone's going to do well, and frankly, you're going to make mistakes. And hopefully they're not mistakes of omission, but it's going to happen. And medicine has ups and downs. As an example, as a neurosurgeon, I do things, and because we're working in a small field and you're the guy, you get all the credit. And the patient comes to you and says, you saved my life, or their family, and they tell you how great you are, and you sit there and go, gosh, that feels so good. But you have failings. I just came back and I operated on a lady Friday and took out a brain tumor, and she did really well. And I'm sitting there going, "That's great." The parents thank you. The husband and children are thanking me. And then in the middle of the night, she got a massive amount of brain swelling, went into coma, and she's on the ventilator. This is a tough business. And I'm a human being. I can only do what I can do. But I don't become cold. Listen, I have to tell the family the situation. I have to be with them. I have to hold them. And it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
But that's our job. Now, there are some doctors who, something like that happens, they're cold, they separate themselves, and that's a way of protecting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Or some people, frankly, there's a group of physicians who become doctors because of the title, and they have personality disorders,
Mm-hmm.
or they're on the autism spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a hard time assessing people's emotional states,
Mm-hmm.
which causes the patients or their family members to suffer as well. But for myself, I try to be there. I have no problem hugging a family or crying with them. But I'm probably slightly different.
I think that's fine. All right, so I also just kind of want to talk about like compassion in the workplace, because as you just mentioned about, there are some doctors who are just in it for the pay, and I myself am very aware of that. I've wanted to be a doctor since I was 3. I put on my first pair of scrubs when I was little, and I told my mom this is all I ever want. But there are a lot of people who just want it for pay. And I think that creates a situation in which you can't have compassion if you don't really want to be there, except for the wrong reasons. So how do you think that, how do you teach a doctor to be compassionate? Like, how would you?
Well, there are a couple things that we know. I mean, one is, unfortunately, a lot of medical schools don't, being compassionate is not part of a qualifier for being a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's high grades,
Yeah.
and sort of it's fulfilling certain criteria,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it a hyper-competitive environment, and oftentimes in hyper-competitive environments, it's become ruthless,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we know, whether it's at a Stanford or a Harvard or a Yale or some other highly competitive schools, there's a subset of people, whether it's in medicine, business, or whatever, who cheat,
Mm-hmm.
or take advantage of situations, or take advantage of people.
Mm-hmm.
And to somehow think that those types of people, once they get their undergraduate degree, once they get their medical degree, once they get their MBA, are suddenly going to be nice people, you're fooling yourself.
Yeah.
The other thing is, there's not one shred of evidence that being successful in life has anything to do with the grade point average.
Mm-hmm.
And don't get me wrong, being brilliant, having access to information, being academic is not to be frowned upon or looked down upon. But an individual who has an above average level of intelligence can probably accomplish almost anything there is in life, perhaps with the exceptions of being an astrophysicist or something like this. But in general, most professions, if you have an above average level of intelligence and passion
Mm-hmm.
and compassion, you can succeed incredibly well. And even in the context, frankly, of pure money, it's not the guy who has the highest GPA oftentimes who does well in that regard. So what we oftentimes artificially view as criteria for success in certain professions, and medicine being one of them, are not necessarily hard and fast criteria. I think we also know that even people who start out compassionate, the manner in which healthcare training occurs beats the compassion out of many of these people. And we're becoming more cognizant of that. Half the medical students are depressed, at least half of the physicians, the faculty. So if we have a system like that where between 30 to 60% are unhappy, the whole way we're doing this is wrong,
Yeah.
right? You have doctors who are overworked. You have a system that I don't believe is the best system. Why is it that 9 out of 10 of the top industrialized countries in the world have universal health care? There's a reason.
Yeah.
And we have a capitalist society, a society that talks about rugged individualism, and I think that's a mistake. I think what we should be talking about is compassionate capitalism, and not the way George Bush necessarily defined it,
Yeah.
but a system that limits how much you can take, a corporate entity can take, that limits how ruthless it can be to the worker, the person who generates things, and actually focuses on caring. As an example, if you look at the U.S. healthcare system, we have the highest cost structure in the industrialized world. We have, if you look at the major measures of efficiency and quality, we're in the lower quadrant, and we have the highest level of dissatisfaction at the highest cost. So we have a problem, right? And we have the highest level of doctor dissatisfaction. So I think we have to go back to the drawing board and recognize the manner in which we have we practice medicine is not the best. We have a bloated healthcare system. We do many more diagnostics than necessary, and it has not shown one improvement in regard to outcomes. As an example, at one time there were more MRI machines actually in, let's say, Santa Clara County than all of the entire United Kingdom.
Wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
And the reason is because when doctors can benefit, when somebody can benefit financially from a loophole, they have a tendency to do it, right? I mean, you should never have a physician or a group of physicians benefit on the backs of illness, right? We know that when a group of physicians or a physician owns an MRI machine, the utilization goes up dramatically, right? We know that when a doctor owns a surgery center, suddenly he starts preferentially referring doctors to his surgery center, and he cherry picks. What he does is he finds people out of network where he can charge the highest amount, right? And all of these things where people unethically game the system, that's a problem. And the problem is usually typically confined to between 3 to 5% of people who are responsible for 80% of problems. And this is repeated all through different areas, and it's certainly true in medicine. Most doctors are good people. They're stuck in a system that isn't the right system. They want to care for people. They don't want to have to worry about whether they're insured or not. They want to do the right things. But you have a system that doesn't allow for that. And that's not to say that the system can afford Cadillac medicine. But it should at least afford Chevy medicine, right? If you want to have Cadillac medicine and you can afford it, well, that's the wonderful thing about a capitalist system. You can get that. But for most people, I think that Chevy medicine or middle cost medicine is perfectly adequate and would result in the vast majority of people doing even better than the system we have today. Plus, again, we know that when a child doesn't have access to health care and grows up in poverty, that child's life is essentially ruined. Period. One of the biggest costs of bankruptcy for families is health care costs. That should not be the case at all. So you see, the middle class and lower class, life is stacked against them in the United States. We used to have a system where you could be middle class and raise a family, be happy, your children potentially could go to college, and now we have a system where both parents have to work to barely make it. And these are educated people oftentimes, and certainly in Silicon Valley that's even worse. But we should have a system that will allow you to live in a home, be safe, be fed, get an education, have health care, have your children safe in school, and actually it would cost less. If you penciled it all out, this would cost much, much less than the system we have today. The problem is, and a lot of these issues are not conscious issues. These are the nature, unfortunately, of how we have evolved as a species. And there's an interesting book called Brain Bugs. And it talks about these failings of our evolution. One is, as an example, this hyper fear state that is present in modern society. We were never meant to live in this society with artificial light, with cell phones, with all of these demands on your time. The other is a tendency towards tribalism. You see, we, until 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, lived in groups of 10 to 50. And when someone suffered, you identified that and you pulled together because you lived in a very harsh environment. But if you create a fear narrative and you scare people, that causes them to pull in, it causes them to separate themselves from others, it causes them to make the other evil, right? Versus understanding that when we all pull together, everyone benefits, okay? You create a narrative about who our enemies are when they're not our enemies at all. 3 days of what we spend on military costs could educate every person in the United States for a year, right? So as a species, we have a hard time looking towards the future, decades away. It's very easy to create a fear narrative today and have us respond. As an example, we know now, of course, the whole issue of the Iraq War was a lie. Okay? Yet, we have spent almost $2 trillion and we'll spend 6 or 8 trillion. If you had no Iraq War, and you said, you know, let's spend between $2 and $6 trillion on increasing the minimum wage, giving universal health care, paying to take care of our infrastructure, building new colleges, right? And you easily could pay for all of that.
Yeah, definitely.
People would not vote for it. We can't afford it,
Yeah.
you see? But you can afford when you create a fear narrative that somebody's going to invade us or kill us or do X, Y, or Z.
Your mention of kind of the dissatisfaction of doctors kind of led me to my next point, which was, do you think that has to do with kind of the new treatments that have come out? Like, obviously, a lot of treatments are getting less invasive, but there are treatments like chemotherapy, which are very painful, and, you know, MRIs, which can be kind of emotionally taxing. So do you think that as kind of treatments get less invasive and, you know, there's more options, do you think that that dissatisfaction will kind of level out as they're forced to kind of do less to the patient? You know, maybe as holistic medicine kind of can make its place? Or do you think that the dissatisfaction doesn't really have to do with the treatment methods?
I don't think the dissatisfaction has to do with the treatment method. I think it has to do with the doctor method. And what I mean by that is in 1927, I think it might be 1925, Francis Peabody made a statement, the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. And unfortunately we have a system that doesn't care for the patient. Again, if all of our great stuff were so great, we wouldn't have the highest level of patient dissatisfaction and be in the lowest quadrant of almost every measure of efficiency or quality of care, right, in the United States. So we have a problem. And frankly, we know that leaning towards the patient, touching them, spending time with them, looking them in the eye, showing them that you care, in many instances is more important than any drug you take, right?
For sure.
So we also know, as an example, that if you exercise in moderation, if you eat lots of vegetables, if you decrease your meat intake and actually limit your diet to, let's say, fish and rarely to red meat, and you don't smoke, that you'll get rid of, and you meditate, right? You will get rid of 80% of diseases.
Wow,
Right?
Yeah.
And in fact, if you look at something called the blue zones in the world, where they implement these, this is the place where people routinely live to over 100. Routinely.
Yeah.
Well, it's Loma Linda, California is one, because the Seventh-day Adventists are there. And they advocate community, which is critically important. They advocate a vegetable-based diet primarily. They advocate exercise, okay? Those are the three things. But if you have a capitalistic, profit-motivated system, do you think the pharmaceutical industry wants that to be out there?
No.
Right. Do you think that they want the government to lobby to decrease the cattle industry? You also have to understand that cattle is one of the greatest causes of greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
Okay? No. And they'll create a narrative and pay off essentially politicians, which is what we have, a system of paying off politicians to pass an agenda. And again, these people are self-interested. You know, when your livelihood depends on you making certain decisions, amazingly, there's a likelihood that you're going to make the decision that will positively affect your livelihood.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I was once in a class, just kind of as a personal anecdote, and we were talking about the importance of veganism. And I myself am almost a vegetarian, almost a vegan, and my mom and dad are themselves. And a girl in the classroom, her father was either working for the meat industry, and she said to me, well, how dare you suggest that veganism is the best way to go? It's my father's livelihood. And I said, well, it's not that I'm suggesting, you know, that your father lose his job, but I'm just saying that if there was significantly less, you know, red meat intake in this country, there'd be significantly less, you know, less interest in disease care because we would be generally healthier.
Well, and the thing is that what they don't understand is, while you may get rid of one industry, if everyone became a vegan, you'd create a zillion more industries,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so there'd be plenty of work. So I think that's a false narrative. But again, it gets back to the same thing. I mean, you know, if your money's made in addicting people to drugs or selling drugs, you're going to promote that. People do not have the ability to objectively look at things or to have that level of self-awareness where they actually admit to it. You see, the nature of humans, and again it gets back, I talked about brain bugs, we have all of these cognitive biases. When you take a period of time to understand what they are, it makes you much more self-aware of your own inherent failings or your own biases, so that you can sit there and say, well, yes, as an example, my father works for the meat industry. Yes, I understand it's bad. That's our situation today. Yes, it's wrong. And you acknowledge it versus deny it. Right? But what happens with people is, as an example, that I used earlier, which was of one politician who was a philanderer and a cheat and liar repeatedly throughout his entire life. You know, for people who support that person, they'll jump through all sorts of convoluted mental exercises to justify that person's behavior that is 100% counter to everything they would normally believe. And this is the nature of humans. When they are confronted with what we call cognitive dissonance, they don't sit there and say, I'm wrong, typically. They double down and deny it even more. And this study after study has been done of this, and it's just nature. And so this is reality. And like I said, you can try to educate people, and sometimes that doesn't help. That's just the nature of some people.
So the last thing I would like to touch on is C-Care and your work with C-Care a little bit. So what do you kind of see as the most pressing problem that faces humanity today? And how does your work with C-Care and just your work being a compassionate doctor, how do you kind of see the best solution for that biggest problem?
Well, I think certainly in the United States and elsewhere, I think that one of the greatest challenges is a lack of compassion. And I have a vision of creating a compassion revolution where we make people soldiers of compassion, and we demand that the system, whether it's the United States or elsewhere, address the needs of everyone, not just our select group of people. And it's hard. And a lot of people have a hard time with this. This is why, you know, whether it's genocide in Rwanda, whether it's Hitler, you know, people have a tendency to support stuff that supports them. But when you realize that you are them, and every action you do in a negative way towards another, you ultimately are going to do for yourself, then that hopefully changes how you see the world. The other reality is, you look in the United States, you know, the United States is 360 million people, yet we consume 25% of the resources on Earth with a population of 7 billion people. So we're 1/21th, right? And yet we consume 25% of the resources. We need to stop consuming.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you look at some of the most rich societies in the context of wisdom traditions, and oftentimes these are in third world countries.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, in my own travels in third world countries, if someone has shelter, if someone has food, if they have security, most people are actually quite happy with just that,
Yeah.
right? Yet we have people here who are worth billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, and are some of the most miserable, unhappy people in the world. So the narrative, unfortunately, that has resulted in millions of people coming to America for a dream, it's oftentimes a hollowness, because having more doesn't give you more,
Yeah.
right? And so that's very sad. Actually, the reality is oftentimes having less makes you happy.
Yeah.
You know, the more things you get, the more things you have to take care of.
Yeah.
And that takes time, energy, effort. And so I think that one of the things we could do is stop wasting money on useless stuff and spend money on stuff that we know will benefit society, which is shelter, which is creating a safe environment, which is giving education, which is feeding people. And when you do all of that, because there's plenty to go around, right? And this is the sad thing, this narrative that there's shortages. You know, if you got rid of every military in the world, we could bring the standard of living up dramatically.
Yeah.
Right? So there has to be will. And I think if we can bring young people, because that's the future, and the next generation, I think, has a much bigger worldview, and understand their responsibility not only to every other human, but to the earth, that's when we'll start seeing change.
Yeah.
And it has to be a narrative of caring for everyone.
And so that brings me to my very last question, which is regarding the foster care system, because it's something that's personal to my family. So there's over 60,000 children in the foster care system alone in California, and there's just rampant need for help for those children. So what do you think is the best way to take care of those children? And is there kind of a universal fact that could apply to them as well as children all over the world in terms of how they need help?
Well, it's a challenge. It's a lot less expensive to stop a child from being broken than trying to fix a broken adult, right?
Yeah.
The problem, though, is it gets back to the same thing I was talking about, this idea of paying now versus paying later. The other thing I know is that almost everyone can turn around their lives if they're given love. We know this. Now, that's not to say you won't have some baggage. I have baggage left from my own difficult childhood that I still deal with. But I can deal with it, right? And with the support of loved ones and people who care about you, that is possible. But at some point, and this is what's horribly sad, you'll see photographs of a child who started out in foster care when the child was 5 or 6. You see this beautiful, bright child. Then you see him at 9. Then you see them at 11. Then you see them at 15.
Yeah.
They've already been arrested 3 or 4 times. They've gotten into drugs. Then you see them at 19, their first time in jail. Then you see them at 21 with all sorts of tattoos, and their life's ruined, right? And in fact, I just saw in the emergency room the other day a fellow who, Hispanic individual who had a difficult childhood, put in foster care at 13, and became an alcoholic. Then got into a gang because he needed protection. They started selling drugs. Then he became an alcoholic. He was in and out of jail for various periods of times for violence and all sorts of things. And now he comes in at age 42, chronic alcoholic, fell down, hit his head,
and has a massive brain hemorrhage and dies. Right?
Yeah.
And the whole time, if that child could have been given a system that was supportive, that allowed him to reach his own potential, that gave him love, everything could have changed. And we see, for me, for other children who've been given that one opportunity by one person, you can see how it can change their lives. That's not to say everyone's going to become a neurosurgeon or whatever, but it means that almost everyone can lead a rewarding, full life and be of service to their community. Okay, and that is there. I think, though, in a bureaucratic system that never has enough money, it's very hard. As an example, I mean, we have within 20 miles of here probably 5 or 10 billionaires.
Yeah.
And those individuals could fund a incredible program that at least would create a system to make it better for foster children,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But somebody has to sell that to them, and that could be you. If that's an important cause and is passionate for you, you know, go ask to interview one of these people and ask them for help.
Yeah.
Ask them for their advice and see if you get them involved, because until someone is made aware, until they can see the suffering of another, they're blind to it oftentimes, right?
Yeah.
So when you can put that in front of their faces, it's like when I went to this interview for this letter of recommendation for medical school. You know, these people had never taken the time, because it's hard to talk to every person, learn about every person. But when you can force them to look at one person, they can't turn away once you show them the humanity of another human being. So if you can find one of those people and ask them to become your partner in helping solve this problem, these people have an immense amount of power and influence. It just takes one of you to help with it.
For sure. So, thank you so much. I can't even express how much this means to me to have had the chance to sit down with you, and you are such an incredible person, and just the love and the compassion that you have shared with me and millions of other young people is so meaningful. So I highly recommend Dr. Doty's book, Into the Magic Shop. And again, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And, you know, none of us should forget that every day, no matter who you are, no matter how much money you have, no matter your position or station, every day you have the ability to make one person's life at least better.
You made mine better.
There you go.
Thank you
Okay?
very much.
Thank you.